I haven't really charted out how far I want to get before the end of the summer. I certainly would like to get through the Lord's Prayer, at least, before we break for the summer. But whatever it is, I appreciate this because I still feel as though I have more to learn in the sermon. So, sorry. There we go. So we've been talking about Matthew 5, verses 38 through 42. We, again, got well into this discussion last week, but let's reread it here. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. Whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow, and him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. So that's what we've been talking about. And Jesus is giving all sorts of practical application after he says, the way that you were thinking about this law was not correct. Let's do some review here, rather than me remind us what it was that we learned. Let's see if some of you can point out to us what it was that we learned last week. What is true about what they've been told? Verse 38, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Is it true? That is the Old Testament, yes. And so we looked at several places in the Old Testament where it does say that. Part of the reason that I ask, is it true, is because actually the next one that we come to is partly true and partly way off. So to understand, if you can think way back a long time ago when I was introducing this section where Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, he's saying somebody told you, but your understanding of it is wrong. Most of these, we've been able to go back to the Old Testament. We've been able to say, well, these are the verses that they looked at. And so to the extent that those verses are in the Old Testament, they're good and proper, but Jesus is saying they're misunderstanding them, and certainly they're supposed to apply them differently from what they were doing. But if you want to look ahead for just a moment to verse 43 here, Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Well, part of that's true. Which part of that is true? Yeah, second great commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus reiterates that. But the hate your enemy part, that is nowhere in the Old Testament and is not even anywhere implied. Other than the discussion that we had on Sunday morning in Sunday school where we were talking about there is a certain kind of hatred that is to be applied, but that's not the kind of hatred that's being talked about here. So the kind of hatred that they said, well, God only said we're supposed to love our neighbors, and so everyone who's outside of our neighbors, we are actually supposed to hate, and we're supposed to put them off as though they're national enemies for us. And Jesus is going to say, absolutely not. So it's partly true even there. But in verse 38, where we are tonight, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, that part is true to a degree. In what sense was that law given in the Old Testament? Well, what was it trying to accomplish, in other words? That law was given. What were some purposes for that law? To protect society. Yeah. Yes, Coral. Yes. Right. Crime, the punishment needs to meet the crime. It needs to fit the crime. The two should go together. And you can't punish someone to the nth degree. Suddenly reminded of something I read as a kid that just absolutely shocked me when I read it. And I think it was a fictional book, but it was talking about things that would really happen in England at that time. A nobleman was riding along, and he happened to see a peasant who had poached a rabbit on his property and was walking home to feed his family with it. And the nobleman just shot the peasant dead because he had poached the rabbit, which was stealing, and there was never going to be any punishment brought on the nobleman. Obviously, the punishment did not fit the crime, and that's part of what this is supposed to address, is whatever you've done, that and no more can be done to you in return. So that's there, and there was a good purpose for it. Where did the people of Jesus' day get off with that? Where did they go astray with that? Okay, well, there were cities of refuge, and that's not bad that there were cities of refuge. Now, they could have taken the idea of the cities of refuge in a wrong way, saying, you know, if that guy doesn't get safely to the city of refuge, then I am free to kill him. And so that definitely brings us in the direction that they were going, where that Jesus was addressing here. So Sandy's got the right idea, but take it a little bit farther. Yeah, how did the people get the application of that law wrong? So it's a good law, but when Jesus says, you have heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist evil at all. What is he addressing that they were getting wrong?
His mercy, because you're not going to apply a punishment in every situation.
Okay.
There's extenuating circumstances that change the punishment.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a good point, that there are extenuating circumstances where sometimes there wouldn't be punishment. When I hear something like that, I automatically go back to the only time I sat on a jury. It was a 2-day trial, and it seemed cut and dried when we first got started. I mean, there was a video up there. Guy came into the bar swinging what looked like a lead pipe. We didn't know exactly what it was, but it looked like he was swinging, trying to hurt people. Witness after witness, these are the wounds that I got. I mean, I just got all smashed up by this guy. And so it seemed like it was a bar fight, but it seemed like the guy was guilty as could be. Yeah, so retaliation, let me come back to that. Let me just finish right here. So it seemed like at first, I mean, he was just going to be convicted and no problem. But over the course of the 2 days, and we're watching this video over and over again, eventually we came to realize that what the prosecutors were saying happened in that video wasn't what actually happened. And the guy never actually got close enough to touch anybody with this thing that he was swinging. And in fact, he was protecting somebody and resolved the situation. So rather than him escalating everything and guilty of all this battery, he wasn't guilty of any of that, other than he was guilty of having bad friends. And yes, he was swinging a weapon, but it actually de-escalated the situation and he got people out of there, and that was the end of it. So his friends were guilty as skunks, but we as a jury found him not guilty of all charges, so extenuating circumstances. Now, the judge did come in and talk with us afterwards, and I think he felt that we should have at least got him. He didn't say that. He doesn't want to call the jury in question, but I could tell by the tone of his questions that he felt he should have been at least found guilty of something in that. But he's like, oh, but here's what you didn't know. Some of those people sitting in the back were FBI, I think he said FBI, because some of these were really big criminals that had been brought in from special prisons all over the place to testify, and they just looked clean as anything. And we're not supposed to know that they were all lying through their teeth. And so there was a whole lot going on that we had no idea about. But extenuating circumstances were definitely part of it. Ray said the vengeance part of it. And that's the kicker, what Jesus is driving at. Now, is God against vengeance? Right, so he's not against vengeance, it's vengeance rightly applied. The problem is, the people had looked at the Old Testament and said, well, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and look, if the guy doesn't get to the cities of refuge, we can take it upon ourselves, so therefore we can take it upon ourselves to get our own vengeance. And Jesus is saying absolutely not. There is a proper place for vengeance, and so we should not think that Jesus is setting all that aside so that no one should serve in the military, or that no one should be on the police force, that no one should resist evil in any sense. Well, Jesus resisted evil. Paul said that the government has been appointed by God to resist evil, and so therefore we ought to submit to it. But what Jesus is addressing here is, do not take it, upon yourself to resist evil. When it comes to you, you need to be willing, we need to be willing to set aside our rights for others' benefit. And so notice in the application that Jesus is going to be making in each one of these, the believer, the follower of Christ, is going to have a legitimate right that they could insist on. If you want to say they actually have a constitutional right for these things that they could stand on, and they could say, no, this is my right, you are wrong, and I'm going to fight you on this. But Jesus is actually going to say, don't. Especially when you are the one to benefit, because he has something else in mind. He wants you to be able to reach the individual and have hopefully be able to reach their heart rather than insisting on your rights. And it's hard for us to see it. And so we're talking about how sometimes Paul resisted evil by asserting his civil rights, and sometimes he didn't resist the evil by asserting his civil rights. And so we had talked about that, looked at some instances in Acts where he accepted the blows, sometimes when he didn't, and instead said, how can you beat me when I'm a Roman citizen? So we talked about some of that, and I just was preparing to give you a filter where hopefully we can think about how do we know whether we're supposed to insist on it or not. And so the way that I've worded it, I have 4 bullet points that I would give you. Again, these are just my own thinking. You can do with it what you will, but this is the way that I see it. When are we to submit? When are we to resist? And by submit, I mean just submit in being wronged in a way that you might have a right that you could assert in that situation. And based on watching what the believers did in the New Testament, we submit to that wrong when doing so will allow us to enter fellowship of Christ. Does anybody know what I mean when I say enter the fellowship of Christ? Oops, thought it's a hand, but I was just scratching. Fellowship of Christ. Okay. Choosing love. Yep, so then you'd have love in common. I had a particular reference in mind. Yes, Jennifer?
I don't know if this is it, but in your scenario, I think of like being able to be a witness to share
Okay.
the gospel.
So being a witness and sharing the gospel would certainly be a part of that. What I was thinking of with this particular wording is Philippians 3:10. Paul says that I may know him. And it's like, yes, I want to know Christ. And he goes on and says, and the fellowship of his suffering. Jesus suffered wrongfully for doing right. Paul says part of knowing him is when we have that commonness in Christ where we have done the right thing and we are suffering wrong treatment for that right thing that we did. Peter also calls us to that same idea that Jesus could have spoken back. He could have turned back their words on themselves, but he chose not to, and we are supposed to do the same when it does have to do with our witness that was talked about, but a certain part of it is we just learn our master when we do what he would do in that situation, when we do what he did do in that situation. And when we can see some good to be gained for that other person by me submitting to the wrong and just taking it upon myself. So there are times in Scripture where it calls for that, and that is part of what Jesus is calling. Emily?
So Paul, who uses citizenship as a Roman citizen, sometimes
Yes.
say, wait a minute, I'm a Roman citizen, you can't treat me this way. And then there are other times where he just allowed things to happen.
Yeah.
But he did pick and choose when those things
Yeah.
happened.
So she's saying she thinks of Paul, how he picked and chose his battles. Sometimes he would allow the beating, and sometimes he wouldn't. And I'll talk about some of those times where we resist. In other words, we say no. But let me give you another time that I believe that we should submit, and that is we submit when doing so will demonstrate the selfless nature of the gospel. And again, Peter addresses that. Sometimes we would have grounds to say, no, I deserve better than what I'm getting here. And yet, that's not what Christ insisted on when he came into the world. That's not what God insisted on when he saw us, who, being sinners, gave his own son to die in our place. And sometimes the gospel is best communicated when we lay down our rights to provide an object lesson that this is what it looks like. Again, this is, I think, what Jesus is calling us to do here. But then the third bullet point is we resist when doing so will protect God's glory. At times, if we just submit to the wrong, then that will not protect God's glory. It will defame him. And so I do think of the one case of civil disobedience that we talk about regularly in Scripture in Acts chapter 5, where the apostles are commanded to not speak in Jesus' name anymore, and they say, ought we obey God rather than men? And that would be an instance of it. But I've also heard of other instances when a challenge needed to be made, even on the mission field, where the gods were being magnified, and to contrast the power of those gods, someone would stand up and do the hard thing in God's name and watch God work. I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to meet Dr. Daryl Champlin, but I had him for Intro to Missions at Northland, and we had him speak at Twin City a number of times. And some of the stories of what God did through him are amazing. They blow our practical theological boxes out of the water of what God would allow this man to do in order to show, no, I worship a powerful God. To give you just one of those illustrations, and I don't know if it exactly speaks to this, the idea of resisting, but certainly he wasn't laying down and taking it. He was in a tribe, I believe it was in South America, and there was a witch doctor of some sort there who was trying to show that he was more powerful than the God that the missionary was talking about. And so he made this huge bonfire. Have you guys heard this story before? Okay, so he made this huge bonfire, and he also had a pile of broken glass bottles, and freshly broken, so they're razor sharp. And he got himself all worked up into a frenzy, and he would go over and he would start dancing on those broken glass bottles. And then he'd go over and jump in the fire, dance around in the fire, and then he'd go back over to the bottles and back and forth. And he had no damage on him at all from going back and forth. And he said, see, this is what my gods can do. Are you going to believe this missionary, or are you going to believe my gods? And so the missionary was praying while he was watching this happen. And so he took off his shoes and socks and rolled up his pant legs, and he started jumping on the glass as well. And he's like, it was strange. He basically couldn't even feel it. And so he just started stomping it. I mean, he stomped that pile of glass down and spread it out, and then he jumped in the fire, and he's like, I couldn't feel the glass, but I could feel the fire. That was hot. But he stayed in there for a while, and then he went home, and his feet were completely blistered when he got home. He's like, oh, this is not going to be good, because the people were going to come check on him in the morning, and he's like, Lord, if my feet are like this, then they're going to think you don't have power. And when he woke up in the morning, when they came to check on him, his feet were completely healed. Now, that's not the way that God works all the time, but that was just one of the many times where God worked powerfully in his case. It does serve the point, though. There are times where if we don't speak up, and if we just go with what's required of us, then God's glory will be dragged through the mud. And so there are occasions, we see it in the New Testament as well as hear about it from missionary stories. Sometimes God calls us to resist, that his name would be glorified. And so there is that. And then sometimes we resist when doing so will protect God's people. And it seems like when Paul was choosing to say, no, don't beat me, it was because there was some need for there to be something on record that it was not illegal to be a Christian under the Roman government. Judaism was protected under the Roman government, and at that time Christianity was seen to be a branch of Judaism. And so when Paul would say, no, you cannot do this, this needs to be tried properly, and then it was tried properly, the Roman leader would say, I don't know why you guys even brought this guy before me. There's nothing wrong going on here. And that needed to be stated to protect other Christians. And so there will be times where, for the sake of the good of others, we need to resist. I think that applies to that illustration or example scenario that I gave. What about a home in which there's an abusive husband and there's the wife there? Should she resist? Should she not? Well, if that husband is being abusive, probably he's being abusive to more than just her, and there's a need to stop him from hurting all the people. She can't just on her own choose to lay down all of her rights if in so doing a lot of other people are going to be hurt as well. So there's a need to protect other people. Any response to anything that I've said there? These are not infallible truths, they're just how I look at life. This Coral.
Just thinking that Paul was on mission and he was a very prayerful man, and he probably wasn't as reliant on reason should I shouldn't I looked up Acts 21 chapter 10 verse 10 where the prophet Agabus came down
Yeah. I appreciate that Coral said that, just for the sake of the camera, Coral said that Paul was a prayerful man and he was on mission from the Lord, and he probably had more guidance on what he was supposed to do in a particular case. So thank you. John?
I think Jesus is also looking at, that, punishment doesn't always, make things better, because, people never really get, even if they got paid back for something, there's still some loss there, you know, of security or, trusting in, you know, mankind, or, if somebody's, put to death for killing someone, the people that want, justice, they don't always get, it's not always gonna be like they think it's gonna be, because there's still a void there somewhere.
Yeah. So if I understand him correctly, John is saying that part of what Jesus is driving at here is the acknowledgement that punishment isn't going to solve everything. There's still going to be a hurt there, even for the person who has gotten the vengeance that they need. There's still going to be hurt. You can't get back what was taken truly. If they steal an animal and they replace it with an animal, it comes pretty close. But if it has something to do with a person, then there's a loss there that is never going to be healed. And so it could be. All right, let's move on to the next one. So far we've looked at Jesus' statement, I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. And what he was saying when he said turn the other cheek, we believe that in their culture there was a lot of shame connected to being slapped across the face. And so he's saying, don't stand on your dignity. Don't make your dignity the whole issue here. If it comes to between you and them, be willing to not only suffer that first indignity, be willing to suffer a second indignity as well, for the sake of not losing that person. He goes to another level here. And again, or maybe not again, but as we move down through these, notice how far we're getting from their idea that if somebody hurts me, wow, I can really get them back. Notice Jesus is taking us in a whole different direction here. Verse 40. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. Now to us that doesn't really, like, tunic, cloak, hardly even know what those things are, much less what Jesus is driving at here. I did at least mention it last week that their clothing was far more valuable to them than what our clothing is here. I very quickly drop stuff off at Goodwill. I very quickly buy other stuff. We don't expect our clothes to last very long. I'm buying multiple pairs of shoes a year. I'm buying clothes. We have children. We're buying clothes, and so for us, it's just a commodity that's used up and goes away. For them, it wasn't a commodity. It was part of their estate, because clothing would last a very long time, and you wouldn't have many. Now, as far as the tunic that is described there, well, there is the acknowledgement that these people are poor. If they're suing you for your clothing, it means you didn't have anything else that they could sue you for. And so they're going after you for your clothing because that's all you have left. And so they're coming after you. Now, there may have been an actual wrong committed. This text seems to give the impression that you actually are in the wrong on some level, and they're coming after you for that. So they sue you for your tunic. That would be, so there were two parts to the clothing. There's the underclothing, which is the tunic, and that's whatever you would be wearing closest to your skin. And then there was the outer part, which was a big wrap that would go over all the top of everything that you were wearing. That outer part, the cloak, that was the truly valuable part of it. It was not only your clothing, it was also your bed. That's what you had to stay warm at night. So The tunic, again, you might have 2 or 3 of those, but the cloak, you only had one. And so Jesus is saying, you're suffering an indignity here. And when you are sued and somebody successfully brings suit against you, don't just submit to that thing. It may be necessary, and he's offering it at least as a possibility, that you might need to go the extra mile. Now, why would he call you to go the extra mile at this? What is he shooting for here? Does he really care about the clothing? While you're thinking about that, I do want to come back to that, but just let me say that this one, what he's saying here is something that they would have said, wait a second, I've got rights in this regard. Exodus 22 verses 26 and 27 say, if you ever take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, and that's referring to the cloak, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering. It is his garment for his skin. What will he sleep in? And it will be that when he cries to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. And so they could say, well, I mean, even in the Old Testament it says we don't have to give our cloak. But Jesus is driving at something that goes beyond the material goods. What is he driving at here? Okay. Love your enemies would be part of it. Yeah. Sure.
I think a generosity of spirit in a way that, you know, we all can kind of just maybe let something slide and be, you know, angry about it or another angry about it and feel like, well, okay, you know, I did something, but to be generous and allow somebody to do something that we don't have to, shows the love of Christ.
Yeah. So to be generous and do something that we don't have to shows the love of Christ. I think that is definitely a part of it. Picture a scenario where, to try to answer my question here, picture a scenario in which someone did something that was wrong. Maybe it's in your household. Though most of us have had kids or watched kids. And so you've got them. There's the strife. You, with the wisdom of Solomon, parse it all out. You actually did figure out who was in the wrong. And so you levy the punishment, and part of the punishment, because you're having a really good day, and part of the punishment that you give is actually the restoration of whatever was wronged to the person who was wronged, and you see that. Regardless of how wise you are in that situation, when is that relationship between the two actually fixed? Forgiveness has part of it, so that would be on the side of the one who's been wronged. There'd have to be forgiveness. But what about the person who did the wrong? How does that person get right with the other one? It's not when they're forced to part with the material, is it? It's when they mean it. It's when their heart is truly in it. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. Part of showing that your heart is really in reconciling this wrong is when you don't just grudgingly give over the thing that you were forced to give over, but when you recognize there's a person here who was actually hurt, and we're going to keep living in the same community for the rest of our lives. You guys, you guys understand small town. Emily and I are from a small town, but coming to a smaller town. But I've already, in the limited interaction that I've had with people here, learned this is a small town. And what you do in one part of the town has ramifications for the whole rest of town, because there are a lot of dominoes that fall when you tip over that one. And Jesus is saying here, do what it takes to get it right with people. Do not harbor resentment. Do not stand on your dignity and go, they made me take or give that, but it's okay, I still know in my heart of hearts that I was wrong. He's like, no, get past that. He's looking for them to really get it right. Now, one commentator, I think, was saying it correctly, that Jesus is not looking for a rock-solid case, that every single time that you're sued for one thing, you have to double it or triple it in order to get it right. They're like, Jesus wasn't saying that anybody should be leaving the courtroom naked. That's not what he was driving at here. So they would have understood. He's not saying that they should give away all their clothing in order to make it right. But nevertheless, he's driving at a point here. The person is more important than the thing. The person is more important than my right. And I ought not dig in my heels. Instead, I ought to do what is necessary to help that person. Let's move on. Any thoughts before we move on to the next one?
Question. So this is talking kind of about Christian liberty, and
In a way, yeah.
I'm just thinking there's a Bible story that talks about that, where we could,
Sure.
I'll think about it.
Yeah, so she said, is there Christian liberty? There has to be Christian liberty applied to all of these scenarios. In fact, all the way through this whole chapter 5 of the Sermon on the Mount, if you were to take it and just rigidly apply it to all of life, it wouldn't work. And Jesus isn't trying to say, this is case law, how you're going to handle every case that comes up in your life. You are always in every situation going to do this. Part of the reason that I've been going to the exceptions is so that we don't try to do that. There are people that do. And they take these and they try to say, well, this is what Jesus said, and he meant it this way always. So going back to the other one, we're not going to serve in the military. We're not going to swear an oath in court. We're not going to do these things because Jesus said, well, Jesus proved that that's not what he meant because that's not what he did. There were instances in which he did something other than what he said here. But what he's trying to do is show us that righteousness, true righteousness, goes way beyond what we normally think about it. We usually think about it in boxes that can be checked off. And he's driving at the heart and going, where is your heart in this? And how are you approaching these things? Because unless you have a righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you are not my disciple and you're not going to be in heaven. You need a new heart is really where he's going with all of this. But he's applying things that you could take case law and say, no, I have a right here. And he's saying, that's not what I'm talking about. So Christian liberty, yes, it applies to these. There will be people who do think they best glorify God by living it out exactly as it's stated here in Matthew 5. If that's really how they think that they're glorifying God, okay. I mean, Romans 14, chapters 14 and 15 would say, if that's really how they believe that they're glorifying God and they're prepared to stand before him and give account, so be it. I don't believe that, and I think I glorify God by sometimes applying this in different ways because I see it in Scripture. So they shouldn't be judging me in that, and I should not be judging them in that. We both have to be convinced in our own minds on this. So there is some Christian liberty here, yes. And again, we shouldn't think that it's rigidly applied to every case. At the same time, we ought not quickly set it aside and go, ha, see, I knew there were exceptions to it, so it doesn't really mean anything, and I can just go. No, Jesus is driving a point in that's really deep, and we really need to wrestle with. That he really wants us to look at life differently from a legalistic, selfish manner. Yes?
So many of these instances, someone is really wronged,
Yes?
and that person who's been wronged has the biggest opportunity to show them Christ through humility.
Oh.
Like, they already did this horrible thing to you, and you're saying, well, not only this, but here,
Yeah.
just offering the love of Christ to them.
Oh.
And, like, wow, this is really heavy stuff.
It is. She said it's really heavy stuff and said that in several of these instances, there are people in the background that have been really wronged, and a person who has been hurt on a deep level like that has a really big opportunity to show Christ's love in a humble way. And I think that is correct in what Jesus is driving at. Coral?
6:35 says, but love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he himself is kind to ungrateful people.
Yeah. Good.
Straighten their standards above the pavement.
Yep. She's looking at Luke 6, which is parallel to this and especially parallel to the next section, and talking about how God is trying to lift their eyes off of what they deserve to who he is and how he behaves. And I agree. All right, let's go on to the next section, the next verse that he says here. He says, verse 41, and whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Haha, I'm a runner. All right, kids, let's go run a mile. Now you got to run 2. Ha! Right? No, obviously not that. Ray, what were you going to say? Yeah, he must have been airborne. That's what Ray's mind was going where my mind was going on that. So when your drill sergeant says run a mile, you have to run 2, right? feel bad for those guys training to be SEALs and they're told to run. No, obviously it's not, we're not talking about that. What are we talking about here? Anybody know off the top of your head? In what situation in the first century would people have been compelled to go a mile? Tom? Yep, a Roman citizen and especially a Roman soldier said, carry my stuff for me. I'm told that there were mile markers set up that would give people an idea of how far that they needed to go. But what would have been the indignity of carrying a Roman soldier's stuff? Tom? Yeah, they are the conquerors and the oppressors. And when you pick that up and carry it for them, in a sense, you're helping their cause. That was a bitter pill to swallow. That was completely against the Jewish dignity. In fact, if you think about John chapter 8, where Jesus says, he who has the Son will be free indeed, or he who believes on me will be free indeed. They say, why do you say that? We've always been free. They still considered themselves to be free in a sense, even under Roman occupation. And so the fact that a Roman soldier would ask them or command them to carry something, I can imagine there were a lot of heads that got knocked to make them carry it even a mile, which the Roman law said. Now, we only have one example in Scripture of someone who was actually compelled to carry something by a Roman in the New Testament. What was that? The cross, yes. When Jesus had been beaten and had lost so much blood that he could no longer carry that burden, someone was compelled to carry the cross there. And so obviously that is something that happened, and it was something that could happen. What is Jesus saying here? That I must be willing to forego my liberty for the sake of the gospel. Now, in offering to go twice as far, you are actually gaining an opportunity. If all you do is what's required of you, there's no opportunity to speak of your faith. It's when you do something that's unexpected and out of the ordinary that you have an opportunity. And it doesn't always result in an opportunity. I think of one thing that happened I wasn't meaning anything by it, and nor did I really stick around. It's not like I had a good gospel opportunity, but in retrospect, it's like, wow, that could be how quick it could be that you could have a gospel opportunity. I was walking through a Quick Trip, and I was just going to get something to drink to keep me awake while I was driving. And as I was walking down, there was a refrigerator door wide open, so I just closed it and went up. Got my drink, went up to the counter to pay for it, and the lady was, thank you so much for closing that door. I guess she was the only one there at the time, and to leave the desk to go close that door would have been big inconvenience. She's like, in fact, don't even pay for that drink, just go. And I didn't expect that. I knew she's trying to be kind, thank you, and away I went. But it was something that was unexpected, unrequired, and really, that particular one didn't require anything. But how much more if, regardless of whether it's required or not, we give up our time, give up our energy to do something, all of a sudden we have an opportunity. And I think that's what Jesus is talking about here. So for a soldier to have someone even willing to carry their pack first time that he told him to, that would have been unusual in Judah at that time. But then to have someone cheerfully carry it a second mile, now they're going to be talking. And there's time to talk on that second mile that you're walking. I never used to think about how long it takes to go a mile, but now I pay close attention to how long it takes. And when I'm running, if I'm not really pushing it, I've got 8 minutes there. In 8 minutes, you can give a gospel presentation. And so there is time in that. If you're walking, it's obviously going to be a lot more than the 8 minutes. But there is time to talk and say, this is why I'm doing this. And also, you have a captive audience in a sense. We talk about how Paul had a captive audience because they had guards chained to him, and he used those opportunities. Those guards couldn't get away, and he was going to give them the gospel. But there was that opportunity there. There was an interest that the soldier would then have. There was an opportunity that person had. I think we used it. Obviously, we don't have that same scenario, but we do have things where someone is requiring from us something that we don't want to do and think that we could get by without doing. We have the opportunity to give up our right on that, the right that we feel, for the sake of the gospel. If you want to look over at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul is talking about the idea of rights to the Corinthians. Let me go ahead and turn there too. And notice he definitely couches the idea of rights and giving up our rights in terms of the gospel. His apostleship was being called into question, and in part it was being called into question because of some things that they felt that if he was a big man, he would have been requiring of them. So 1 Corinthians 9, he says, "Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord." Here we start getting to the important part. I want to look at verses 3 through 6, and then just for the sake of time, we're going to jump down to 15. But he says, "Here's my defense to those who examine me. Do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do others of the apostles, the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working?" He's referencing certain things. He and Barnabas would work to support themselves. And they're like, you must not be free, you must not have rights. And he's like, really? We don't have rights? Well, others of the apostles, they're not working, they're accepting gifts. Others of the apostles, they're married, they're bringing their families along with them. Couldn't we have that right too? I suppose we could. Couldn't I do all sorts of things? But notice in verse 15 how he explains all this. He says, "But I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done so to me. For it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void." What is he boasting in? He's boasting in what the gospel can accomplish. That's really what he's doing. And he's like, if I was to insist on these rights in my case, it would hinder the gospel. And I'm not going to do that. If I can give up all sorts of things that others who are even in the ministry can do, I will give it up if that will further the gospel. Notice there are more important things in life than our rights to our comforts. All sorts of things that we might be able to do, it might be important to give up for the sake of Christ. And that's what Jesus is calling us to do, to recognize, yes, that might be okay. Paul says another time, all things are lawful for me, but not everything is expedient. There are things that, yes, we can do it and no one can look at you and say, that's a sin, and yet it still might be important to give it up for the sake of the gospel. And that's the heart, I think, of what Jesus is driving at here when he says, if anyone compels you to go 1 mile, you have a right at the end of 1 mile to say, nope, you can't make me go a second mile, but give it up. And that's what he's calling for. One more of these. Let's go ahead and take it. And then if there's anyone who wants to follow up on any of this, we can do it. Meet the need. And there's actually all sorts of relevant conversation that we can have on meet the need from the final verse here. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. All right, I'd like to ask each of you for $1,000 tonight. Jesus said, don't turn me away. What in the world is going on with this one? And there are people that try to make a living on this verse because Christians aren't supposed to turn down anyone who's asking. And so they go through the directory and they contact every church in town asking for all sorts of stuff. And again, I have fielded dozens of these calls of people calling for gas cards and to have their insurance paid or their water bill paid and their heat paid and their rent paid and all sorts of stuff. And so what are we supposed to do? Jesus says, give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow, don't turn him away. What are we supposed to do with this? By the way, first Sunday that I was here, we had the homeless lady back there. Remember that back in January? We had the homeless lady. And that day I knew this verse was coming. and that would be an illustration for this. So, so think about that as an illustration. What did we do there?
Did you ever see her again?
Never saw her again. No.
She lives very close to where we live.
Yeah.
At-
Like very close to our flag.
At least if she lives where she said she did.
Uh-huh.
Well, I know,
Yeah, Kathy.
I know just through Andy, he's like, never just give them money to meet their needs.
Right.
So I think that we met her need, we fed her,
Right.
we gave her something warm to drink, and when Ray and I got
That's
here, we
right.
assumed she had been sleeping in her car
Right.
the night before, for sure she was ill.
Yep.
So we fed her, we gave her something warm to drink, and then we provided gas.
Right.
And that
Yep. I think we handled that situation exactly right. Kathy mentioned, gave her food. There was food here. I forget if it was donuts or what it was, but it was the food that we had on hand. Shared it with her, by all means. Happy to do that. And also gave her enough gas in her tank to get her where she said she was going. And so that was the appropriate thing to do in that case. It would not have been appropriate for us to give her a gift card that she could go over and get whatever she wanted with at the gas station, because likely she wasn't going to be getting the right stuff with it. But to actually meet their needs, that is something that when God has given us resources and has put the need in front of us, to meet the need, and that's what Jesus is talking about. Person who's asking to borrow something is someone who has a legitimate need. They are very poor. Go ahead and turn to Deuteronomy chapter 15, and we see something that sheds some light on what is being described here. It shows that we must be willing to reduce our comfort for the sake of someone who has a legitimate need. Deuteronomy 15 verses 7 through 11 is where we'll be looking, and it says, "If there is among you a poor man of your brethren within any of the gates in your land which the Lord your God is giving you," notice, what kind of a man is there? It is a poor man. Now, there are lots of reasons that people become poor, and there are lots of reasons that people stay poor, more than I had any idea. I, up until recently, thought if they would just make a couple different decisions, that they would be out of poverty very quickly. And I have come to learn in research that I've been doing for the food pantry that we're running, that that's not the case. There's a lot that goes into them being poor and staying poor. And so sometimes it's a decision or two, oftentimes it's not. But coming back here, so God says, if there is a poor person within any of the gates of the land which the Lord your God has given you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand from your poor brother, but you shall open your hand wide to him and willingly lend him sufficient for his need, whatever he needs. And these are needs that this individual has, whatever it is that he needs. Now, it isn't that God is giving this charge to any one person to feed all the needy people that come in his range of being, because then that person would very quickly become poor as well. That's not what God is talking about here, but nevertheless, there is a legitimate need that this person has, and you have the ability to meet it. Now, notice verse 9. "Beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release is at hand, and your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing." What's going on with that 7th year thing? Anybody know what's going on with that 7th year? Okay, that and debts were forgiven at 7 years. And so you're like, oh, we're halfway through the 6th year. I mean, we're six years and a half into this. If I give him money right now, I mean, he could have just run up a debt for another half a year and then had all of his debts forgiven. Why am I going to help him out right now when he's just got to string it along a little farther and everything gets forgiven? God says, do not do that. That's evil intention on your part, and goes on to say, "And he cried out to the Lord against you, and it becomes sin among you. You shall surely give to him, and your heart should not be grieved when you give to him." because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your works and in all to which you put your hand. For the poor will never cease from the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall open your hand wide to your brother, to your poor and your needy in your land. There's some deep truths here in this passage. And although we're looking back to Jesus' time, and he's looking back almost, well, half as far into his past as what we are looking back to his time, more than that actually, the fact remains that this is true. God says, there will always be poor. When I hear the fact that there's always going to be poor, part of me, or my initial response, just confession, when I hear that there's a need that no matter what I do, the need is always going to be there, I'm usually like, then why would I get involved with that? And God's point is, because the needs will always be there, it is timeless. Be involved in their lives. He sees it very different from what I do. And don't just pass it off. When I hear the 7th year part of it, part of me is inclined to think that there's, well, I do think there's an application to our day where we're like, well, there are government programs. So why should I do that? Because the government's going to take care of this for them. And sure, there are government programs, and part of it is because communities are not taking care of their own, and so there are government programs in place. Some of them are good, some of them are not good. There's a lot to it. There's also a lot to deciding how to help the impoverished person. If we as a church were just paying for every every heating bill that comes across the line, and we're constantly giving out gas cards and food cards as a church and just constantly doing that, are we really meeting needs? I see one person say no. If everyone who asks us, we immediately respond to that, are we really meeting the needs? No, we're not. There is responsibility that those people have. And their sin has real consequences. And we want to be careful before we just up and meet needs that we are not we're not sheltering that person from the consequences of their sin. And so it's important to spend some time with that person and really get to know them. How did they come to be in this? What are they doing about it? One key for me, usually when I'm deciding whether or not that's a case that I need to be involved in or not need to be involved in, is I want to hear a plan. How much have you done so far? And what will you be able to do if I do this? So with the lady who was here, she said she was trying to get to Marinette, and she seemed to be on her way to Marinette. Okay, well that's a plan in place. And if she did get to Marinette, she was going to be able to get help. Okay, great. We can help you get to that point. There was a family that called up last year, and they were moving from Sheboygan up to Marinette for work. He knew that there was work to be had in Marinette, and so he was moving up without a job, but their only vehicle broke down by Peshtigo, so needed some help. And I interviewed him, and he had a plan in place. So I'm like, well, there are things I can't do. I'm not able to give out money. The church doesn't equip me to do that, but we do have a food pantry. I can give you food. And he's like, yeah. So I got him food and also some simple utensils so he could cook that food for his family in the hotel room. 2 days later, he called up and said, my truck is almost done being repaired, but we're getting kicked out of the hotel today. Can you give me a lift to another hotel? Again, he was in the process of doing what he could do. He just needed a little help. I was able to do that. I think I was able to help him one more time, and then after that, it's like, I can't help you anymore. I've taken you as far as I can go, and now there you are. It's a wisdom thing, and I'm not saying I get it right every time. I'm sure I don't get it right every time, but it's a wisdom thing. Just because someone is asking, Jesus is not trying to say you have to dogmatically help every single person. By the way, did Jesus help every single person that he could have helped during the time that he was on earth? No. Sometimes when the teeming crowds were coming for help from him with their sick, he would leave there and go somewhere else because he wasn't about that. He was about his own mission that he had to accomplish. So even Jesus didn't help with every physical need that he needed to. But there is a danger here when we start thinking to those ends. See if I can find the quote that I'm looking for here. Many people, I'm not seeing the quote that I was looking for, but the idea is many of us, when we're thinking, you know what, there are organizations in place, and probably they were guilty of something to get in that situation anyway. When we are quickly thinking along those lines, oftentimes it's a revealer of our heart. We are selfish, and we just don't want to get involved in that situation. And if we are like Christ, we will not wait until they are someone who has picked themselves up by their bootstraps. We will not wait until they are someone who is lovable. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That is always the pattern, that God interjects himself into the situation before the person is lovable and before the person is worthy, and he takes on great sacrifice for them. We as his disciples ought to do the same. Any quick thoughts before we are finished? Yes, John?
When the weather was as cold as it was, that was a concern.
Yes.
You know, it wasn't just, it would have been summer, it wouldn't have bothered me as much.
I agree. The weather is a concern. By the way, I don't know what it is in Marinette, but I usually run into most of the homeless people in late August or early September. And suddenly they think living under the bridge is a good thing to do there. I'm like, you do know it's going to get a lot colder here, right? Oh yeah, but it's okay. I don't mind camping out. Okay. They're not still there by November. So I don't know where they go, but they find somewhere else to be. Yes, Coral?
I've heard of this big angels unawares. I found it. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it.
Is that Hebrews 13:4?
And it goes on before. It says, remember the prisoners as though in prison with them, and those who are ill-treated, since you yourselves are also in the body. Thinking that we are all in a human condition, and it could be there for the grace of God why.
Yep.
That we can with people, things that we can't do.
Remember the strangers, remember the imprisoned, and entertain them. Yeah. All right, let's pray and we'll be dismissed. Dear Heavenly Father, Jesus is cutting deep in what he says here. We hold our rights and our comforts very tightly. We hold our desire for vengeance very tightly. Bitterness, anxiety, these are things that we struggle with because we do not release our rights the way that Jesus is calling us to do here. I ask for your help. Only you can work this change in our hearts, but you say that if we are your disciples, this will be the case. And whenever you are working it in our hearts, it always requires us to be part of the process. Help us to be selfless like Jesus has called us. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.